My name is Ann Lee, and I am the second year pharmacy administration resident with the Memorial Hermann Health System. And today I'll be doing part 2 of project management. So a recap of part 1, Amanda has spoken to you about explaining the project to your stakeholders. So it's really important to get their support and their buy-in, and that way you can discuss any issues that you may not be aware about at the beginning. It's also important to define the roles and responsibilities for all members of your team, whether it's a project sponsor, the manager, or the content expert. This also helps everyone on the team know whose approval you'll need at specific times within the project, and then hold a kickoff meeting. So this is a formal meeting where everyone is together in the same room and it allows you to discuss the project before you start. So just by show of hands, how many of you have ever completed a project in the past? So everyone should have completed a project. From whether it's big or small, it could be planning a wedding to implementing a new workflow in your department. So what about how many of you had a project that finished on time every step of the way? So 1. Okay, well, what about how many of you had a project that did not go over budget, whether it's finance, work hours, personnel time? Okay, and then how many of you experienced a change in a direction with a project? So you're midway through and something happens and you gotta go around. Okay, so you're not alone, and here's why. Time, scope, and cost is known as the triple constraints. So these are the most important and yet opposing constraints that all people go through within a project at any point in time. So with scope, you're thinking about scope creep. So getting the additional requirements before you finish the project, but right after you have already kicked off. And then with these, if you change one of the constraints or one of the corners, you will likely impact one or both. For example, if I decrease the finance that I'm giving to a project, most likely I'll have to decrease the scope of the project and narrow down. If I increase the time it takes to complete a project, I'm most likely impacting the cost. Sometimes what you'll find online is that there'll be a fourth metric to this, which is quality, and it's usually in the center because quality is impacted by all 3 time, scope, and cost. So one way to manage our scope is to define it from the beginning. So some things to consider is the timing. How much time do I have to finish this project? Resources that would be affected, products and service lines that will be impacted. For example, if I'm making a change in the pharmacy department, will this affect HR? Would this affect nursing? Any sites involved? Am I a multi-site institution? Would if one change in a process at my institution affect the changes at another institutions? So one way to do this is by using an in and out frame. So you essentially draw a frame on a board and then allow members of your team to write on sticky notes the answers to these points to consider. And as a team, determine whether the responses is in or out of frame. So you place it outside of the frame, that means it's out of scope, and you essentially don't have to worry about it. If it's something that you do have to worry about, it'll be inside the frame. And then if it's on the frame itself, it could be in or out depending on the circumstances. So it'll be on a safe base. You just want to address those concerns as well. Okay, so now that you have the scope, you're going to develop a scope statement. So the purpose of the statement is to provide a description of the project and really describe in detail what the intended outcome of the project is. Some things to include are the deliverables. So what is my major output? Exclusions. What do we not think about for this study because we determined it to be out of scope? What's the quality? So once we get that output, is this something that we'll accept or do we have to revise it to get a better quality? And what's my acceptance? So when do we determine that this project is complete? Constraints. So what are some limits that we have to be aware of in the beginning and throughout the study, whether it's cost, time, or any other resources? And then assumptions. What did our team members assume during this project, and do those assumptions hold true throughout? So now we'll develop project baselines. So this is usually set at the end of the planning phase, in the beginning of your project and execution control. This really well-defined project baseline will help you compare your progress throughout, and this includes scope, schedule, or time, and cost. So now breaking it down, one of the tools that you can use to measure scope is through the work breakdown structure, or WBS. So what this essentially does, it takes all of your deliverables, your large deliverables, breaks them down into smaller components and then smaller tasks or activities. The level of detail that you want on this really depends on your team. The more detailed it is, the easier it is for your project manager to determine who is accountable, have we completed that task, or what are our variances in completing those tasks. So there are two suggestions to this. You could do what they suggest. Number one is that your lowest level of detail or activity can only be assigned to one individual and not consume more than 40 hours of their work week. The second one is the 8 and 80 rule. So not less than 8 hours and no more than 80 hours. Cost and schedule, on the other hand, are usually combined together because cost is time-phased. Essentially what it means is cost, with the cost, you're combining both the cost and the schedule, and this helps you identify exactly what point in your proposed schedule the cost will incur. This gives you a better picture of the cash outflow. So how do you determine cost? You take all your activities, estimate the amount of time that will take the resource to complete those activities, and then multiply that by the hourly wage that the resource has. Once you get that number, you'll take it and plot it on an S-curve, your budget and then your actual. And the variance, or the height between these two lines, will give you how well you're performing. So the closer the two lines are together, essentially you had a strong baseline and you're doing well in terms of where you said you would be. If your variation is wide, then that's a key for you to go and identify what issues are coming up that we did not plan, and then how can we mitigate those to bring the lines closer together. As far as schedule, besides estimating the duration, you also want to determine which tasks are dependent on the completion of another. That way you can allocate your resources and time appropriately. And then finally, creating that management plan. So once you have all these baselines, set up a way to manage these, to review them, and then to look at any variances that you see. It includes creating a review and approval process for modifications. So who has authority to make reviews, modification suggestions, and who has the authority to actually approve them. And they actually suggest that you have different levels of approvals. So if it's something that's a big cost item, maybe making that your project sponsor or the CFO of that project. If it's something a little bit more minor, then just having that content expert or the project manager manage that. It's important to note that not all project approvals will be approved, or project modifications will be approved. It really just depends on the impact and whether that project will be completed within the time frame, within the cost, and within the scope that we dictated.